This is just to wake everyone up. So. If not. So while I was preparing for this shiur, somebody asked me if I'll actually be able to put together a full 45-minute or an hour shiur on the Shiloach. How much is there to say? So Baruch Hashem, as we'll see tonight, there is a lot. And in a stroke of Hashgacha Pratis, shortly before Shabbos, I found on my Otzar Chachma a 250-page sefer just on the Shiloach. And the reason I say it's Hashgacha Pratis is because otherwise we might be here the whole night. So it doesn't incorporate everything that's to be found in there. One of the big questions is where exactly do we begin? So not in the classical way of this year, starting at the very beginning. I actually would like to start closer to the time that we live in these days. This way we get a little bit more of an understanding about the archaeology that exists around Eretz Yisrael now.
It happened on the very day I managed to measure most of Hezekiah's tunnel. In one hand I held a lamp and compass, and in the other, a notebook in which I recorded the tunnel's gradients. My pencil was in my mouth most of the time. Suddenly the water started to rise and it all got out of control. The water quickly filled the tunnel and I had to lift my head to the ceiling to breathe. At that very moment I accidentally swallowed my pencil. I started to choke.
The commission began in England when Queen Victoria founded the Palestine Exploration Fund, the PEF, and sent Charles Warren to explore the site of the temple on the Temple Mount. He was the first to discover the subterranean levels of the walls of the Temple Mount and of the Western Wall as well. One of Warren's greatest discoveries was the city's ancient water system, a massive waterworks known to this day as Warren's Shaft.
In 1867, the archaeologist Captain Charles Warren crawled through a tunnel near the Gichon spring. About 20 meters from the spring, Warren discovered a vertical shaft that rose to a height of 13 meters above his head. With great effort, Warren climbed to the top of the shaft, where, to his amazement, he discovered that the tunnel continued to rise steeply until it reached the city above.
I'm sure quite a number of people in this room have been to Ir David, the city of David in Eretz Yisrael. And if you go through there, some of that's not a great surprise. But many of us think to ourselves, wow, in 1867 something was discovered. What does discovered mean? I think to many of us we would think discovered the same way we didn't know about America before Columbus discovered in 1492. He actually discovered Mexico, by the way. But if you think from the Native American Indian perspective, they weren't discovered in 1492. They existed all along. So something that people have misconceptions about is that everything physically that Charles Warren discovered was there all along, and perhaps just people had a very different conception of what it was. So before that, I'd like to go to another explorer whose name is Edward Robinson, who went to Eretz Yisrael about 30 to 40 years early in 1838, 1839. He's regarded these days as wrong about all of his conclusions, but as often happens when you go through a whole process, you actually get much greater insight about a lot of things, and I actually think that if someone's looking for insight into this whole subject, you'll get it more by reading his works than that later of Charles Warren. He wrote a book with a boring name title, something like Biblical Expeditions in Israel. But one of the things he wants to do is he wants to find the names and everything to do with the water that speaks about in Tanakh, specifically in Yeshaya and in Malachim. Now, Edward Robinson, just a little bit about him, he was a Christian who lived in America, but he was so interested in Tanakh, and he learned Hebrew, and he became a big considered, I don't know if he got verheard by any Talmidei Chachamim, but he was considered, he knew Hebrew very well. And his point was actually he wants to prove that everything in Torah is literal, and people who say it just never happened, etc., is not true. So he came to Eretz Yisrael, and on his own he was doing a lot of touring around Yerushalayim. Before I go into his descriptions, he actually notes a very interesting thing. We can fact check that here. I didn't have time to look into it, but he notes that as far as he's concerned, in all of Tanakh and all of the Talmud, you don't have a single time when the Jews in Yerushalayim were suffering from thirst. There might have been famines, they didn't have food, but in Yerushalayim specifically there was no thirst because there were water sources. And I can't remember off the top of my head such a case. If someone does, let us know. Anyways, he came to Yerushalayim, and as you see over here, roughly the boundaries of the Old City, what's known as the Old City. For those who are not familiar, the area which is the pink area is the Armenian quarter, the blue area is the Jewish quarter, the green area is the Muslim quarter, and then you have the other one up here is the Christian quarter, and this area is the Temple Mount. Now, if you go to the Christian quarter, I'm not recommending that you do, but if you go there, there is a pool there, which is known in Hebrew as Brechat Chizkiyahu or Hezekiah's Tunnel. In better days, this is what it looked like, and you can see there's a very big grand pool there. This photo was taken in the year 1862. More recently, this is a photo which was taken around the year 2010 when the city of Yerushalayim decided they needed to do something about this because it was very polluted. Most of the water in this area actually came from runoff, sewage runoff that was coming from the various houses. They decided to clean that up. They also redirected all the drainage piping from rains and stuff like that were diverted away. And that's why if you visit these days, that's what Brechat Chizkiah looks like, and probably for that reason, that's why Google says that it's permanently closed. There's no pool really to see there over there. Now, Robinson was not the only one to think that this is a very important pool from the perspective of Tanakh. With a name like Brechat Chizkiyahu, and many Jews of that era certainly regarded this, as we'll see later, it speaks about Chizkiyahu building a pool, they regarded this to be the pool that he built. Now, if he built the pool there, it's very clear that this pool was coming, water was coming somehow through either a tunnel or a conduit. And the question is, where exactly was it coming from? Well, at the time that he visited, there was a conduit which was taking you to Brechat Mamila, to Mamila's pool. Some of us think of other things when we hear the word Mamila, but nearby, not quite where Mamila is, but behind it, you had an area with a gigantic pool. This is a photo taken in the year 1854 and in 1864. And Edward Robinson writes that the tradition amongst many of the Muslims that this was the Gichon spring. And you can actually see this comes from after his time, but you have a portrait of Mamila pool, and over there at the bottom the caption is the Gichon spring. And similarly you find later on various pictures, various portraits, etc., showing you Mamila pool. Now again, these pools these days, or more recently, were just rainwater, and once the Yerushalayim was modernized and the city, all the waterworks were fixed up, if you do go today, you will find Mamila pool looking roughly like that. So we're not going to spend too much time watching that video, but there's very little water to be seen. If you did go in the winter after rain, you might see, as you see in the corner, there's some water, but typically it looks like that. Okay, so he referred to this as the upper pool, because in Tanakh it speaks about a lower pool, it's an upper pool, we'll see the psukim later, but the problem is the upper pool is somehow connected to the Gichon. In Tanakh it speaks about a spring known as the Gichon spring, Main HaGichon, and there's no spring in that area. So he concluded that there must be a spring somewhere in that area, but I put a strike through there because he said he couldn't find it, and it must be that it's somehow blocked. It's not accessible, it's just doesn't exist. Now, he then points out, sorry, I did make a bit of a mistake with regard to his conclusions. He regarded this as the upper pool, and this is a pool that Chizkiyahu built. Then he notes that there's another pool over here called Brechat HaSultan, I think in Hebrew, Sultan pool. This is an undated photo. I don't know exactly when it was taken, but again, in better days, and again, if you visit these days, that is roughly what it looks like. So he regarded this to be the lower pool that you have that's spoken about in Tanakh. He had a little bit of a problem, and that is that there was a tradition amongst the Jews of Yerushalayim as well as the Muslims that there is a place called the Shiloach, or in English it's somehow corrupted in the translation, it's called the Siloam pool, and that is in this area which is very far away from the action. So he conjectured, and he says clearly he's not sure, he says maybe there is some underground tunnel which somehow takes you from this fountain that he cannot find, and it goes all the way there, and that's probably, I don't know, 2-3 kilometers underground. He said it'd be very interesting, hopefully in the future someone can explore that and see. Now, one of the downsides with his approach, besides many we're going to point out, is that he ended up increasing. If you look in Tanakh, there's no reason to say necessarily that there are 3 pools and that there's so many conduits, but that's his perception. And to some degree, some of his conclusions match what people in Yerushalayim would have thought at the time. So this is a picture of the Siloam pool of the Shiloach if you visit these days. I actually took that photo. But this is in the time that he went, it would have looked more like that. As you can see, there was less buildings around, and there were buildings that were built up after that time. All right. Now, here's the part which gets very interesting, and that is that Robinson himself realized that there is a spring, where I just put that red mark over there, there is a spring over there, and it was one that the Jews, the residents of Yerushalayim definitely knew about. And he wondered what this spring could possibly be. In his book, he cycles through a lot of theories. He even mentions there are those who think it might be the Gichon, it might be the spring of the Gichon, but he conclusively says there's absolutely no way that could possibly be the Gichon spring because it doesn't match all of his conclusions that he drew with regard to the rest of Yerushalayim. This was back in the day, right around when he visited, there was another American, his name was David Roberts, and before the age of photography, or was very new, so artists usually actually used to paint vivid pictures about real scenes, as opposed to just taking paint and splattering everywhere and calling it contemporary art. So this is how he would have seen this fountain, which was not known exactly what this fountain is, with a person standing at the top. In this photo, in this picture, you don't really see so much the water. There's a whole series of steps to go down here. But more recently, we do have photos. Obviously, if you go to Ir David these days, it doesn't look like that. And this was a spring that the Jewish people would frequent and the Arabs would frequent. The Arabs would frequent in order to do the laundry. The Jewish people would go there as well, but they also went to this. They regarded this as a very important site where they would go to mikveh. Why did none of the Jews, at least Ashkenazim, think about connecting this to anything in Tanakh? Because there was an old Masorah that this fountain is the mikveh shel Rabbi Shmuel Kohen Gadol. And nobody knew why. Like, if you look through Sfarim, anyone heard of a Mayan and mikveh that has to do specifically with Rabbi Shmuel Kohen Gadol? It's not known such a thing. But nevertheless, this was the Masorah, and because of that, it was regarded as a holy place. And the Ashkenazim of Yerushalayim used to go there, mikveh, especially Erev Yom Kippur. They did have a problem. This is a Muslim residential area, and the Arabs, when the Jews were going to mikveh, sometimes they'd come out of the water, their clothes are gone, and things of that nature. So they actually hired a very, very strong, tall, brawny chassid to go and to guard it, which he did for a couple of years. But after some point, unfortunately, the Arabs, they ganged up all together and they assaulted him all as one, and he couldn't defend himself, and unfortunately he died from his wounds. And after that, it became much harder for the Jews to go to mikveh. Specifically, Rabbi Meir Auerbach, he was one of the Rabbanim in Yerushalayim. He was like the right-hand man of Rabbi Shmuel Salant. He used to make it a practice, specifically on Erev Yom Kippur, that he would go to the mikveh. And one interesting thing that you won't really hear about too much if you go to Israel these days is something that he describes, that sometimes the water level was decently high and sometimes it was very, very low. So he even describes how one Erev Yom Kippur he came, it was so low, he laid himself flat and he still couldn't get in, so he told his shamash to keep pushing him down until all of his body is under the water at the same time. Now, that sounds like a very strange thing, but Robinson himself describes that when he came to Yerushalayim, he heard these rumors about the Gichon being this kind of spring that starts and stops, starts and stops. Now, we're actually looking at a time-lapse video of a spring in Wyoming, in case anyone's ever visited, called the Intermittent Spring. And the reason I chose that is because, as far as I know, it's the only spring that's like that these days. But it's a spring that starts and stops, starts and stops. And if you go to this one, apparently it's on a cycle around every 20 minutes. It's flowing, it stops, it's flowing. It's interesting how Robinson describes how when he heard this, he writes in his book that this was just one of the outlandish rumors that he heard in Yerushalayim. These things that absolutely made no sense, he didn't believe it. However, when he came to the spring, he noticed, not initially, but after spending some time there, that the water level was rising and falling, rising and falling. And he's wondering what's going on. An Arab woman came by and said, yeah, this is a common thing, happens every day. The water gushes at specific times. And we know the reason for that. That's because in the ground beneath there's a very big dragon. And when the dragon is awake, the dragon keeps the water from flowing, but from time to time it needs to go to sleep, and then it's not there to protect the water flows out. Now, until very recently, we're talking about the last 20, 30 years, it's documented this is the Gichon. The Gichon was not a constant flow. It was starting and stopping, starting and stopping. What could possibly be the reason? Now, what I'm going to present is a theory. It's a very sensible theory. That's what scientists accept was the reason, but there's no way to prove it because you can't do ultrasounds on big mountains. But basically, the assumption is that you have the way the water flows is a kind of siphoning situation. So the water gathers in a cavity within the mountain itself, and then as the water level rises, as you can see on the right, it creates a siphoning effect. And what happens next is even if the water comes down, the water is still being sucked out very, very quickly through that siphoning effect until it breaks the air seal. And then you need to wait for the water to rise all over again, rise again. And when you have that sort of rhythm, then you have what's basically called an intermittent spring, a rhythmic spring, a pulsing spring. There are different words which are used to describe it. This is how the Gichon functioned for many years, for centuries presumably. So we take you back to this video and we could understand what's happening.
And it all got out of control. The water quickly filled the tunnel, and I had to lift my head to the ceiling to breathe. At that very moment, I accidentally swallowed my pencil. I started to choke.
So Baruch Hashem, he survived, but he basically was in the tunnels at exactly the time when the water started to flow. And Robinson could have made that mistake, but he went through the tunnel soon, as we'll see, before he knew about this issue. Now that's also very interesting because Rashi tells us in Masechta Brachos that the name of this spring is Gichon, and it's not connected to Gichon that we have in Sefer Bereshis. It says when Hashem created the world, there were four great rivers, V'Shem Hasheni Gichon, Hu HaSev V'Kol Eretz Kush, from memory. So how do you get a river from Kush? What does that have to do with a Maya and Gichon in Yerushalayim? So first of all, there is the opinion of the Ramah Rabbeinu Meir Halevi, is also discussed by Daruch Liner, who says that they're somehow connected. And many Mefarshim learn that must be some sort of spiritual connection, but to get something, a river flowing somewhere in Africa connected to a spring in Yerushalayim seems physically not the Metzias. However, Rashi says that there are just two different rivers with two different water sources with the same name. So the question is, why would it have the name Gichon? There are different conjectures, different reasons which are suggested, but one of them is the word Gichon is connected to Negicha, Kiigach, as Rashi alludes over there. And if you think about a ox goring, it's not constantly goring, even though that's what it looks like there, but it charges and then recedes, charges and recedes. That would describe the Gichon perfectly. Now, there's no way to say for sure that that's the reason for the name, and also we don't know for sure that that's the way the Mayan flowed in the times of the Beis Hamikdash. In the last, as I said, in the last 20 to 30 years, it has stopped flowing that way, and it's just now a continuous flow, and scientists say they cannot detect any change in the water pressure, and there are different theories why. One possibility is if there's a siphoning system, perhaps that got damaged as the ground rock moves, and perhaps you don't have an airlock anymore. Another possibility which is suggested is that there's so much water collecting in Yerushalayim because there's so much more water due to piping and irrigation and everything, the rock collects more water, so that cavity, the water level is so high that it will just be constantly flowing water, and it never gets to the water never gets depleted enough that you have that rise, start, stop kind of flow. Okay, so that is a little bit about that. Now Robinson, when he was in Eretz Yisrael, he was the first one who realized that there's some kind of connection between the two sites. So here we have the Shiloach, here we have the Gichon, and he brings that there's a tradition. Some people say that maybe they're connected. So he decided, you know what? Let me try it out. That's what made him an explorer. So he starts out one day on the Shiloach side. He describes how he came there and looked around, and Baruch Hashem, no one was there. When you read his book, you see that every time they did something, they wanted to make sure no one's there, because if someone's there, they'll tell the authorities will mix in, they won't be able to achieve anything. So they immediately started climbing in, and they start going through this tunnel, and there's a constant flow of water coming through the tunnel towards the Shiloach, and the tunnel is getting shallower. It got to a point, he says, 800 feet in, he felt he couldn't go anymore, it was just too shallow. So with his candle, he smoked into the ceiling of the tunnel the letters ER 800, that was his initials, and 800. Then 3 days later he came to the other side and he had some Arab workers go remove the stones that were blocking the entrance there, and he figures he has about another 300 feet, because in total he measured that the two water sources were about 1,100 feet apart. So 1,100 minus 800 is 300. He starts going and going and going, 400, 500, 600, 700, he almost gives up. And eventually after around 800 feet, he discovers that which he put in the wall. Now, he did not make a proper survey of the tunnel, but if you look at the tunnel that exists, there are two blue lines over here, but there's a more squiggly one, and that would explain why, even though a distance from here to here is only 1,100 feet, but the tunnel itself would be considerably longer. And as I said, Edward Robinson could not figure out, it's actually so interesting to read. He says this must have been outside the city walls. Why would anyone have gone to the bother in ancient times? That must have taken years to build. Why would someone build a tunnel like that? Now, we can only talk in terms of theories, right? But Robinson's presumed to be wrong, and it's a good example of paradigm blindness. You're so stuck in a certain model that you can't see the strongest clues in front of your eyes. The reason he felt that is because he regarded these to be the city walls that existed in the time of the first and the second Beis Hamikdash. So if these are the city walls, then you go through the Psukim, it wouldn't make sense that the Shiloach is around there. And he just took that as an absolute granted fact. However, Charles Warren, when he came about 4 to 5 decades later, as I said earlier, contrary to common misconception, he didn't discover anything physical that nobody knew before, right? But he came and he started introducing a different way to look at everything. For those who are interested in history, by the way, he was the police constable who was dealing with the Jack the Ripper case in London, but just saying that as a side thing. Okay, so he, first of all, is noted because he's the one who did the first proper survey of the tunnel. He was able to produce a map showing people all around the world what this tunnel, how it flows. But he's the one who came up with that that this might be the area, and he had many other reasons to say that this might be the area of the old city, at least in the times of the first Beis Hamikdash. So he completely discarded Robinson's theory, and he came up with a much simpler one, that this is the original old city area in the time of the first Beis Hamikdash, and in the second Beis Hamikdash, where it expanded further west and then eventually north. And right, so it would have expanded that way, but this is the original area. And then this puts these two sites in a very prominent place with regard to the Beis Hamikdash in Yerushalayim. Now, as I'm going to emphasize again and again, a lot of this is, at the end of the day, these might be very solid theories. We could call them 99%, but we don't have a time machine, we can't go back. But there's a lot of evidence, even in Chazal, which would support that. One of the Mishnayos that we learn in Masechta Midas speaks about the dimensions of the Har Bayis. It was 500 amis by 500 amis, and the Azara itself was 135 amis at width and 187 in length. Now, the Mishnah speaks roughly about how the Har Bayis was situated how the Azara was situated in the area of the Har Bayis. So, please take note of the directions. And comes to maps of the Beis Hamikdash, usually west is always on the right, because Shechina b'Mayra, but right is the most important side. And if we look from this dimension, so we see that the biggest space of the Har Bayis, as the Mishnah says, Ruba min Hadarim, the greatest space in the Har Bayis that people could congregate was in the south. What is the reason for that? One of the reasons, which is brought in Mefarshim, like the Tosfos Yom Tov and others, is because that was the side where Yerushalayim was most populated, which we'll come back soon. It was most populated, so it makes sense that if you have multiple entrances to an area, you make the biggest area where people are going to congregate, where they live, where they're coming from. So the southern side was the most populated. The Mishnah continues, Sheni Lo Min HaMizrach, that on the second biggest space was on the east, and the reason for that is fairly obvious, because When we go in here, you want to enter the Azara, although there are gates here, but generally a regular person coming to the Beis Hamikdash enters through that way. So that was the reason, that was the second place. So it's the main Azara entrance, but also the rule is whenever you have a choice to go right or left, you go right. So therefore, if someone wants to go to the Beis Hamikdash for any other purpose as well, meaning, to give an example, if I had to go here, then halacha dictates I have to go the right way and not the left way. What's interesting, by the way, is even though that first right turn forces you ever after that to take every left turn, but it doesn't matter. Once the one you have a choice to take is the first turn, you have to go right, even though later on it's going to force a number of multiple left turns. Okay, then it continues. Shiloach min ha-tzafin. You had the third biggest area was to the north, and then the smallest area was to the west, and the reason for that is there's normally no major reason for a person to be here, but also kavod hashchina, it's not appropriate that someone should be behind the Kodesh HaKodashim. So what do we see over here? The Mishnah is indicating to us, as explained by the Mefarshim, that the south is the part which is the most populated. Now, if we look at this rough image of Yerushalayim, which is a painting describing Yerushalayim as described by Josephus, so Yosifun, so here's the Beis Hamikdash, this is the south, and this is the west. And you can clearly see that in the time of Herod of Hurdus, most of Yerushalayim is actually to the west and not to the south. What happened? Well, Josephus himself describes that Yerushalayim started to the south and then wrapped itself as it grew to the west. So, taking all of those things together, so where is the site then of the real old city? If we're going to go with the model of the old city walls that exist now in Eretz Yisrael, that's somewhere around there, right? That's somewhere around there. And whereas we're talking about an area over here. When I personally actually went to Ir David, so the tour guide was saying those walls everyone calls the old city walls, they're really the modern city walls. Okay, that's just the way he put it. That's one sort of piece of something from Chazal which would support that idea. Another one is that when we look, in the past I've given a shiur about the archaeology about all the walls of the Har Bayis that exist today, but we're looking now at the southern wall. In Masechta Midas it says Shari Chulda min Adorim, that the gates of Chulda were to the south of the Beis Hamikdash. Meshamshin Knista v'Yitzia, the purpose was to enter and exit the Har Habayis. Why is it called Shari Chulda? Chulda means a weasel. It doesn't sound like a very honorable name for the Beis Hamikdash. So there's a lot of explanations. The most famous one probably is that Chulda Hanaviyah, there was a prophetess who held court, and according to many Mefarshim was in this general area. She obviously lived in the time of the first Beis Hamikdash, whereas we're looking to model the second Beis Hamikdash, but it doesn't matter, it's the general area. However, the Rosh and others bring this idea that a Chulda lives B'Ikare Habayis in the foundations of the house, and then there's one way that it's explained is that just like the foundations of the house is the Ikar is the main part, so too this was the main entrance. So this is the main entrance, or according to other opinions, as we'll see soon in some videos, that these gates, they're so low that presumably you had to walk through a tunnel before you entered into the Har Bayis. That's also described by Josephus. Okay, that came a bit too late. Now there's actually remnants of these gates, so to speak. I've gone through this in the past, but we're just here, so we'll quickly go again. We're looking now, the Chulda had two sets of gates. So if we look at the Har Bayis, this is, just to give you a bit of perspective, that's the Kaisam Arabi, that's the temple wall, that's the Western Wall Plaza. And we're looking, this is the Al-Aqsa Mosque, that's the Dome of the Rock. As I've spoken in the past, that this is a mosque. This is not really a mosque, it's just the Arabs regard it as a shrine. It's not a place where they actually go to pray. If we look in this area over here, we'll see that there's a place where there's an entrance which is partially covered up. Now, I'm not suggesting that those stones are there from the time of the Beis Hamikdash, they're not. However, it's usually a given that when walls are destroyed and rebuilt, that the gates go more or less in the same place. So the presumption is, if you look at the type of stones you have until this place, and then you look at the stones in this place, this is a gate area which has been filled up. Now, the rest of that area is blocked by a mosque. But if you fill in that gap, you can see over here that there is what is known as the double gates, and that is presumed to be one of the sites of one of the Shari Chulda. If we go to the other side, so we're able to actually see that. Some of you might be into the archaeological park to the south of the Har Bayis, and over there you can clearly see again, a site where there would have been a gate. This is known as the triple gate. Again, there's no suggestion that this is the exact gates of the Beis Hamikdash, not at all. It's not as described in Tanakh, and it's not of the same stone, but it's the general vicinity. Okay, here we have a video, might be a bit choppy, we'll see what happens, but sort of giving you some sort of feeling perhaps. Josephus describes walking underground over here, and that you'd have these beautiful archaeological, architectural designs in the ceiling, etc. This is obviously just a video giving you a general perception. And when a person would finish walking through the tunnel, they would come up into the area of the Har Bayis, and they would see the Beis Hamikdash generally from the southern perspective. Now, thanks to Warren, we have things that we otherwise wouldn't know, because these days, try and find out anything on the Har Bayis, it's impossible because the Arabs are not willing. In fact, we know for a fact, literally constantly, on a constant basis, they're digging and destroying. They want to take away any sign, any connection of Yidden to the Har Bayis. But this is image, this is in the map of Warren, and you can see over there he speaks about a double tunnel, right? So not just gates, but a tunnel. He says that he got through on the other side, and underground there are tunnels. So you have a block gate area, but if you can go through the other side, there is tunnels that take you into the area of the Har Bayis. Now the following is just a video, which again is just artist's impression. It actually comes from Megalim. Last time I used Megalim videos, I got questions about whether it's appropriate to use in Chinuch. I'm not making that statement. There is the Megillas Lester effect, and that's something you should take to a mechanech, so I won't go into that now. But it does describe, Josephus describes the magnificence of a person who's approaching the Beis Hamikdash if he entered from the main entrance, which was the side of Yerushalayim that people were expected to come from, so to speak.
The main entrance to the Temple Mount were the Huldah gates in the southern wall. 2 gates were planned, an entrance and an exit. This ensured that the huge crowds would flow in and out quickly and efficiently. The great width of the steps leading to the gates created an atmosphere of splendor and reverence. The stairs were designed with treads of varying sizes, forcing the pilgrims into a relaxed, dignified pace as they ascended to the holy place. When they emerged at the Temple Mount Plaza, the pilgrims saw an astonishing sight. The huge plaza, the Stoa, the courts, the ornate gates. At the top of the hill, towering to the heavens, rose the temple building itself. Wide in front and narrow in back, the temple reminded the ancients of a seated lion, his mane facing forward.
So as I mentioned in the past on this shiur, which is connected to the Har Bayis, Josephus describes that the most impressive approach to the Har Bayis was if you came from the southwest. If you came from the southwest, which is essentially more or less what we did, but he's talking about from the city itself, going up all the way through the steps and coming out. Now again, why do I mention that? It's not proof, etc., but Warren speaks, he's assuming that the south is the place from which people enter. The south is the original city of Yerushalayim, and it makes sense that this is the place of entry into the Beis Hamikdash, which has been the Masorah all along. Now, Warren was the one who decided, therefore, if the old city is there, that fountain that Robinson struggled with is the Gichon, and that tunnel is the tunnel that Chizkiyahu dug in order to connect it with the Shiloach. We're going to get soon to the Psukim, which speak about why and what Chizkiyahu did, but he put all of that together. Was he correct? So we'll see the next piece of evidence.
Just 10 years later, a young Jerusalemite boy proved that the great explorer was right. Yaakov Eliyahu was a bold, adventurous lad. One day, he almost managed to pass through the entire length of the tunnel. Almost. At the last second, just a few yards from the opening, he slips and falls into the water. Yaakov Eliyahu recovers quickly. He tries to grab hold of the tunnel walls, but then he feels something strange. They were letters in the ancient Hebrew script. The Salome inscription was written millennia ago, in the same language that we speak to this very day. And it tells of the great drama of quarrying the tunnel, a story that appears explicitly in the Bible.
So a couple of comments about that video. First of all, Yaakov Elio was about 16, so probably looked a little bit older than he looked over there. His sister recounted later that he wasn't sure whether he should go in, because on the one hand, people were saying that the great explorer said that they connects the two sides. On the other hand, he's hearing these rumors about dragons, so it's another thing about dragons. I put in proved over there. I think it's a very important word. Sometime you will go to a place in Eretz Yisrael where tour guides will tell you it's 100%. There is no 100%. It's like you going into a house and trying to figure out what the owners did in a specific room 60 years ago. I would say that this is a very good theory, and that's why we're going with it throughout this year, but I don't want anyone to walk out of here thinking that this is somehow established halachic fact or Torah fact. It's just a very good theory that really adds everything up, and we don't really know of another theory that matches up. Certainly, there are still, by the way, people who will defend Robinson's theory against, but that's a much harder theory to accept. Anyways, it speaks about something in the Torah, so we're getting a bit closer. I'll play in that next video, and then we'll go through the details a bit more. Be'iyun.
And when Hezekiah saw that Sennacherib was coming, and that he was determined to fight against Jerusalem, he took counsel with his princes and his mighty men to stop the waters of the springs which were outside the city, and they did help him. So there gathered a large group of people together, and they stopped up all the springs in the brook that ran through the midst of the land, saying, "Why should the kings of Assyria come and find much water?" Prior to Hezekiah's rule, all this water flowed outside the city through irrigation channels to the fields of the people and to the king's gardens.
The army of Assyria would camp outside the city walls, gaining access to the city's water source.
He decided to prevent their use of the water by blocking and sealing the springs outside the city, including the Gichon spring. He diverted the spring's water into an underground tunnel which had been quarried into the heart of the mountain. Two groups of masons worked towards each other from both sides and met in the middle of the tunnel. And the water flowed from the source to the pool. The tunnel ends at the pool of Shiloach, which was inside the city, behind protective walls. The account of this engineering wonder is mentioned explicitly in the Bible and is also documented in the Shiloach inscription, which was discovered 6 meters from the end of the tunnel. The masons were swinging their axes one towards the other, and they heard the voice of one man calling his fellow. And on the day of the tunneling, the masons bore through, one man towards his fellow, axe upon axe, and the water flowed from the source to the pool for 1,200 cubits.
So here we have actually the Shiloach inscription. Unfortunately, it is to be found these days in outside of Eretz Yisrael. We'll talk about soon. Now, it's written in what is understood to be Ksav Ivri, which most Rishonim hold that before the times of Ezra HaSefer, I've given a shiur on this in the past as well, but before Ezra HaSefer, this was the Ksav, the font, the script, which was used for mundane purposes. So although many of us will not be able to read this, perhaps none of us can easily read this, but each letter there corresponds exactly to one of the letters of the Aleph Beis, and if you just know how to switch those out, you can read it. For many years, if you go, that's all you would see, and that's because there's a whole story actually how it was gouged out, but make a long story short, it was removed during the Ottoman reign, so it found its way to a museum in Istanbul. And not to be outdone, Ir David put up their own replica. The Israeli government has actually been trying to get it back, and different efforts. In fact, just under 10 years ago, Bibi Netanyahu invited the Prime Minister of Turkey, and he said, come to Israel and take whatever treasures from our museums that you believe is Turkish in trade of that. And they refuse, even though if it's not really displayed so often, from time to time it reappears over there. Now, that video, if I had to bet, so we don't bet of course, but the odds, it sounds very good and I would go with that. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of things taken for absolute granted, and I want to emphasize there's no absolute granted. That sign tells us that there were 2 workers coming from either side. It doesn't say anything that they were instructed to do it by King Chizkiah. It makes sense because if you look at the dating and everything else, it makes sense that's what happened, but they're the ones who draw that link to what it says in Tanakh. It also speaks about the engineering wonder. I don't know how many people know this. When the Brooklyn Bridge was built, it was built from the 2 sides, as is the way of the world these days. You start from both sides. There's a lot of engineering brains that goes into making sure that they meet. The engineer behind the Brooklyn Bridge, he misjudged that by about 1 inch. And to him, it was such a crisis that unfortunately he jumped off mid-project, and they needed someone else to go and complete it. And to scientists these days and archaeologists, they're just blown away by the fact that 2,000 years ago you could have this super long tunnel which winds around, and yet they met. Now, when they met, it wasn't such a perfect meet, but it was certainly good enough for the purposes that they met exactly together. Let's look at Divrei Hayomim. And it speaks about, as we saw in the video, the king of Ashur is coming, Sancheriv, and he's coming to conquer Eretz Yisrael. And in Tanakh, it's spoken about a couple times about the water in the time of Sancheriv, and it's always very brief. The first observation is that it starts off speaking about Meimei Ha'ayonis, or Eskol Ha'mayonis. It speaks about springs which are outside the city. And it's in the plural, it's not in the singular. Then it speaks about a nachal hashayta b'seich haaretz. You have a stream which is flowing in the midst of the land, which is exposed somehow to people who are outside Yerushalayim. If we look at the word Gichon, we see Gichon is linked to the word ha'elyon. That's why we spoke about Robinson before. You had Gichon in the upper. So Gichon is in the upper place. And when it speaks about Chizkiyahu stopping up the spring, but at the same time he led them. Some people think that Chizkiyahu completely blocked up the water and the water is completely gone, besides the difficulty in blocking up water, but the pasuk continues that he led them somewhere else. So it would appear a simple shot in the pasuk is that he stopped them and he led the water somewhere else. Now, I'm just making all these observations now. I hope some might find that confusing, but we're going to come back and we're going to see how all of those things are actually important. But for now, I'd actually like to focus on a different part of that pasuk, and it says he led the water to the west. Now, if you learn that this is the city of David, that this is the original main part of the city in the times of Chizkiyahu, then you look at where the Nachal Hashayta B'chol Haaretz is accepted to be, I can't see from here so well, but if you look over here, there is a straighter kind of conduit, and then you have a much more squiggly one. So the older conduit, we'll see soon, exists and is dry, but it's accepted that that is the place, the way the water originally ran from the Gichon to the Shiloach pool, which is in this bottom area over here. And that would have been right at the edge of the city walls, seemingly outside the city walls. So that would help us understand, and as explained in the video, what's accepted is that the water, what Chizkiyahu was concerned about is the water is flowing right at the edge of Yerushalayim. During regular times, it's very accessible to the people of Yerushalayim, but at a time of war, when we have to block up the gates, then the people in Yerushalayim can't get to the water, but all the water is available for those who are outside the city walls. And you also had lots of outlets in that tunnel, which would lead waters out, which could be the Mayonis that it's referring to in that pasuk. So this gives us a little bit of a view about the supposed Ir David. So the Gichon is over there, the Shiloach is over there, and the water would originally have flowed that way, and he diverted it through the middle in order to bring it to exit over there. All right. Now, this would explain a seeming contradiction in Tanakh. In Malachim, it also speaks about the things that Chizkiyahu did, and it says clearly over there that one of the things he did is he made a brecha and a ta'ala. He made a pool and he made a conduit, he made a tunnel. However, in Yeshayahu Perek Zayin, it speaks about something that occurred in the lifetime of his father, Achaz, before Chizkiyahu was born, because Chizkiyahu, his birth was foretold in Yeshayahu Perek Zayin. And it speaks about Yeshayahu is meeting Chizkiyahu's father, Achaz, in the Kseh HaTa'alas HaBrecha HaElyona. Again, you have the words Ta'ala and Brecha. And the Malbim and other Mefarshim say that this is all connected. This is all connected. So the question is, how could Achaz be meeting Yeshayahu at a place that his unborn son built? However, according to this conception that we've seen about the Shiloach and the Gichon, we can easily understand. There was an older Ta'ala, which came from the Brecha HaElyona, the place where the Gichon spring was the upper pool, and from there you had one tunnel which was flowing. And Chizkiyahu came and he built another tunnel, which he would have expanded the Shiloach in order that the water should come from the other side. A common question some of you might be thinking about is, why would this not be spelled out super well? Why wouldn't everyone know about it? So very often when we get caught up with the learning, we forget like simple facts of life. I don't think anyone here knows the piping in the street over here underground, under this building. We don't tend to focus on these things. Imagine if you lived in the time of Chizkiyahu. You know there's a war coming and Chizkiyahu is busy with the water. Do you bother to find out exactly what's happening? No. So it makes sense that such a thing would not necessarily have been preserved for generations. Now we will get very soon to much more the Torah discussion, the Shiur part of this year. But just for those who haven't been to Ir David, we'll just quickly see a couple of segments of videos, just to give a bit of a perception of what it is to visit these days. Now there's a whole other part of Ir David, even the water system, which I'm ignoring because it's not connected to Chizkiyahu. But you come to the right area and there are stairs to go down and you have a choice. You can go left or you can go straight. When I went, I didn't even notice the left because tour guides just take you right past. I don't know if anyone here noticed the left. But if you take that left path, then that takes you through a tunnel which is higher up. Well, if water is flowing and there's nowhere to go further down, it'll go higher up. And this takes you through a long tunnel, which as we saw follows that on the map, what you saw the older conduit path. Okay, this video goes on and on and on, but we won't go through the whole thing. Okay, if we go back to those stairs and we go further down, then we get to the bottom of the stairs. It's very hard to take a proper photo there, but on the right, when we're coming down, on the right is where the water is flowing from the Gichon now, and then it continues under that metal walkway, it continues to flow through there, which you can walk through these days if you visit Ir David. Okay, so some of you might have taken this walk. You walk through, and sometimes the tour guide leaves you alone to do it, and it gets deeper, shallower, it's changing. We won't speak about the tunnel too much. It is about a 15-minute walk, so we're not going to bother doing the whole thing, but let's just focus a little bit when you come to the end, what you see. So coming to the end, you are able to see the place of the Shiloach currently these days. Now obviously it's a lot easier to walk through because the whole thing has been excavated properly and made safe, but as we saw, the explorers went through with a lot of difficulty because there was a lot of sediment, a lot of buildup. It was very, very hard to go through. Okay, if we look at this picture, actually this one over here, we can actually see where the water is coming from. Now this pool, funnily enough, it was chosen to be the picture of the slide. This pool is the one thing that definitely has nothing to do with Chizkiyahu at all, because this is Byzantine architecture. This was built in the 5th or the 6th century. It's a whole story around that, but it doesn't really matter. The poles are, the columns are understood to be the pillars that were holding a structure which was built above it, which has since crumbled, no longer exists. Now, if you go beyond this area, you can see over there a staircase, and if you go up that staircase and you come down the other side of the staircase, which you have over here, you are able to visit another part of the Shiloach, which was discovered, sorry I went a bit too quick, was discovered only about 20 years ago. So this is actually, if you go now, it doesn't look, it's a bit, they've changed it a little bit. But this was, there was an Eretz Yisrael, they were doing excavations, they wanted to build a building, they dug down and they realized they uncovered something which seemed like from ancient times. They called in the archaeologists and they started clearing the place out and discovered the place which is accepted as the pool that Hurdus would have built. Now, we don't know what happened before Hurdus. It could be before Hurdus there was a pool which was directly beneath it, which came from Chizkiyahu or before. It could be Chizkiyahu's pool is a bit further down. No one knows, because until it's excavated, we don't know exactly where everything lies. But this is definitely from the era of the second Beis Hamikdash, and this is when we speak about people coming to the Shiloach for water, as we'll talk about soon. This is at least in the end of the second Beis Hamikdash. This is the general area where that would have happened. This is an artist's impression of the Shiloach of Hurdus. We don't know for sure, because until they excavate, they'd have to buy all the buildings over there, knock everything down, start building, start excavating, and then they can see exactly how big this pool is. It's just an artist's impression, but it's showing you what it might have been if you lived in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, to look at the relationship between the Beis Hamikdash and the Shiloach. And here you see the steep descent. And yes, if you're looking from here up towards Har Habayis, that looks very grand and magnificent, as I mentioned earlier, from Josephus. And this would be a good time to start looking then at the relationship between the Shiloach and the Beis Hamikdash. The first thing most people probably think of is the Simchas Beis She'eva, or Nisuch HaMayim, I should say. So here we have a Sugya Masechta Sukkah. We'll learn a little bit of it. And in there there's a Mishnah. that just says Nisuch HaMayim Ketzad. How did they do Nisuch HaMayim? They had a tzleicha shel zahav, a golden flask. Machzeka shleisha lugim, it held 3 lugim. Hayimemalim min Shiloach, they filled it up from the Shiloach. They took it specifically from here. So here is our golden flask. Probably looks something like that. Higiu l'shar HaMayim. When they came to the Beis Hamikdash, to the water gate, this water gate had 4 reasons for that name, but for now we'll just focus on one. It was called the water gate because the Nisuch HaMayim was brought through here. Taku v'heriu v'taku, say the Kaihanim blew tkiyah through tkiyah, and they blew the, in other words, there was a lot of fanfare, pomp, and ceremony. If we look at the Har Bayis, so they're coming from the south, and this is the Shar HaMayim. And it becomes apparent straight away that this is the closest shar, the closest gate of the Azara to the Shiloach. Okay, the Mishnah continues that Ola Bakevesh, the Kohen, he went up the ramp. Ufana upina lismoila, and he turned left. And that was a chiddush, because normally when you go up the Mizbeach, it doesn't matter why you're going up. Generally, you have to go take a right turn. Even if I had something to do here, for example, I had to walk up this side and go the whole way around. There were 3 exceptions. This was one of them, Nisuch HaMayim. And he went up here in order to do Nisuch HaMayim. How exactly did it look up there? Well, maybe not exactly like this, but the Mishnah speaks about how in that general area you had Shnei Sfalim. You had these 2 basins, okay, and one was for Nisuch HaYayin, one was for Nisuch HaMayim. And there's machlekes about everything. First of all, the Mishnah mentions it had chaytmin dakin. It had these fine nostrils. What do nostrils mean? Spouts. According to Rashi, this video is made to match Shittas Rashi, where the spouts poured the water and the wine on the poured it out of the basin and into holes which went through the Mizbeach to the foundation of the ground. Taisus disagrees. Taisus says that the spouts would not have been visible. They were at the very bottom of the basin, and they went straight down through the Mizbeach to the Shisin, to the foundations under the ground. Furthermore, the Mishnah says that Echad Mu'ubah ve'Echad Dak. One of them was wide, the other one was narrow. Kadei sheyushneim kolim b'vas achas, in order that they should both stop flowing at the same time. One kohen, as we'll see soon, would pour the water. The other one would pour the wine at the same time. Wine is a lot thicker, and therefore it flows slower than water. So water, we have to slow the water down. So one of them was wide, one of them was narrow. Rashi learns that this is talking about the spouts, that the one for the Nisuch HaYayin had a wider spout, the one for the water had a narrower spout, and this way they timed it that both would finish at the same time. Taisus disagrees, and Taisus holds that the narrow and wide are talking about the basins themselves, that the wine needed to have a wider basin because it didn't flow down so quickly. The water could have a bit of a narrow basin because it flowed down a lot more quickly. Okay, the Mishnah continues that we see over here 2 kaihanim. He's pouring the wine, he's pouring the water. The one pouring the water has to lift his hands very high. That's very inconvenient, and that's why normally for the wine they didn't do that. Why? Because there was a kohen who was a tztuki, who was not moideh in the idea of Nisuch HaMayim, and so instead of pouring it on the Mizbech, he poured it on his legs. And the entire nation, they stoned him with esrogim. I'm sure the esrog vendors love that because they got to sell everyone another esrog. Okay, so probably. But anyway, so we see over here that they wanted to make it very clear from that point onwards. Hold your hand very high, so it's very clear to everyone how you pour in the water. Shabbos, there's no eru between the Shiloach and the Har Bayis. So kamaseh b'chol kach maseh b'Shabbos. Elo shoyim malim erev Shabbos. On erev Shabbos, they would fill up a golden flask in a vessel which was not holy, because otherwise you'd have a problem of lina, which we won't go into now. Sheinu mukadeshes min hashiloach u'manicha b'lishka. They would put it in the lishka. The Gemara asks a question on this Mishnah. Mino hani mili, from where are these words? Now, a basic in learning Gemara is very often the Gemara asks a question and it uses a pronoun. And it's important to work out what the pronoun is referring to because it could change the whole pshat in Gemara. The Gemara says, Mino hani mili, from where are these words known? Which words? We had a whole Mishnah. So much information, which words are we talking about? And the answer is, we know it from the pasuk, Shafta mayim b'sasin, you should draw water with joy. Rashi learns the Mishnah spoke about blowing trumpets, excitement, pomp and ceremony, simcha. How do we know that Nisuch HaMayim involves simcha? So, Ushaftim Mayim B'Sosin, that is how we know it because it mentions the word Sosin. Tosfos disagrees. I just brought Rashi and Tosfos together because Tosfos brings Rashi, disagrees with Rashi, gives their own shot, and says, V'od yesh lefarish, we're not looking how do we know that it's with joy, but how do we know that we use the mei hashiloach? How do we know that we need to use the Shiloach waters? Why can't I use other waters? Okay, it continues because it says, Mimayone hayeshua, from the springs of salvation. How does that tell us you need the Shiloach specifically? It just seemingly seems to tell us that you need springs. You need spring water. This is not the only spring around Yerushalayim. We have a Tosfos Rabbeinu Peretz, one of the Balei HaTosfos. He says like Tosfos, but he adds a couple words. How do we know that we bring from the Shiloach? Mishum dichsiv mimayone hayeshua. You need to bring from the springs of salvation. Shemei oisei makim, from this place, Yeshua tzomachas la'ad Yisrael, salvation will grow for the Jewish people. Now, as far as I could tell, I don't know if anyone else has looked into this, as far as I can tell, this is the only source in Rishonim I could find anywhere that tells us why this spring is called Mayone HaYeshua. We all heard this passage many times. Why is the Shiloach called Mayone HaYeshua? What does it have to do? Why does it have that title? Rabbeinu Peretz is saying it's called that title because this is the place from which salvation grows. What does that mean? Stay tuned. We'll get to that a little bit later. But so Rabbeinu Peretz, and he's one of the Balei HaTosfos, it's a safe presumption that Tosfos holds the same thing, that we're not just bringing a source that you need a spring, you need a source for the Shiloach. It is the springs of salvation. Continuing in Rashi's vein though, Simcha, we all know that Simchas Beis Sheva was involved with a lot of Simcha. So just a couple of scenes on that, but moving forward. Okay, another thing which is actually discussed in Masechta Sukkah, a link between the Beis Hamikdash and the Shiloach, was what happened 9 times already in Jewish history, but the first time didn't involve the Shiloach, and that is the Para Aduma. So everyone knows the general gist of the Para Aduma. It was burnt on a Mizbeach, which was built on the Har HaZeisim, which faced the Kodesh HaKodashim. Now, the bridge which was used to connect the Beis Hamikdash and the Har HaZeisim was kippah al gabe kippah. You have all these domes. By the way, Charles Warren discusses when he visited the Beis Hamikdash, he has a whole story about how he fooled the Pasha and he went underground to the Har Bayis, and he was amazed by the amount of vaults that existed under the Har Bayis. And he said, what do you need so many vaults for? You need for water, food, gold, everything. You can't fill all this up. But anyone who's learned Mishnah and Gemara knows that a lot of things that were built in Yerushalayim were kippah al gabe kippah, were vaults on top of vaults or domes upon domes. What is the reason for that? Because there are certain areas we have to make sure that there's no tumas mace. How do we know that maybe someone has been buried, let's say under this bridge, and 1,000 years before the Jews got to Eretz Yisrael? How are we supposed to know? Or you could even have a Yid before Yerushalayim was conquered. A Yid could have been buried there in the first 400 years or so that the Jews were in Eretz Yisrael. So an easy way around it was that halacha is that tumah does not, if you have an enclosed space, tumah will go through it but not above it. So that's why you build one series of kippahs, but you still have a problem if you have a tumah which is there, it could still ascend. So you do these alternating rows of kippahs in order that if there's a tumah, it's going to hit a vault somewhere if it goes up, and it's never going to get to the top. Now, why do I go into this? Because the Gemara discusses the great efforts they went to ensure that the Kohen who burnt the para, who was involved with the para, was tahor. And it speaks about how they would gather, the Gemara in Sukkah says, gathered mothers who were pregnant, and they would move into buildings in Yerushalayim, which would build kippah al gabe kippah, as you can see over here. And for a number of years, till the children were around 8 or 9, they grew up in essentially COVID-like conditions, like social distancing. They were alone from everyone else because they couldn't come. The whole purpose was to ensure they came into no contact with tumas mace. Sometimes we learn halachas and we think about, what did this mean by mitzias? You had mothers who had such mysterious nefesh that they're giving up the next 10 years of their life for the paraduma. It's just an unbelievable thing. Anyways, why did they go to... Now, the Mesiras Nefesh goes further because the Gemara says Al Pi Halacha wasn't truly required. But since the Chachamim there were certain leniencies that the Tzdukim don't agree with, and so we incorporated those leniencies to show the Tzdukim that they're wrong, but in order that no one should think that the Parah Adumah is not important, they made corresponding stringencies. This whole thing was a chumrah as a counterpoint to the kulas that they were making to deal with the Tzdukim. And yet there was this tremendous Mesiras Nefesh for years and years in order to ensure that we have children who can bring who can help out with the Parah Adumah. What was their role? Their role was to get water from the Shiloach in order to add ashes, because the Parah Adumah, you need to take the ashes and put it together with spring water. So they needed to bring the spring water in purity to the Kohen. The problem is this whole idea works as long as they're in confinement there, but when they leave, how do they stay tahar? So the Gemara tells us that they had these very big-bellied cows, and upon the cows they had these boards of wood, and the kids would then go directly onto these boards of wood, and it does the same thing, that if they're walking in a place where there's tumah, it's going to go up, it's going to get stuck, so to speak, it's not going to rise above the board of wood. When they came to the Shiloach, it says that they got off and they went into the Shiloach and they drew water. Here you have an interesting machlekes rishonim. How do you let them off? Right? Because there might be tumas meis there. So all the Rishonim agree that that we don't have to be worried about people being buried there, because no one would have been buried there if it was always a place that was flowing with water. But there is still a machlekes. The Tosfos Yom Tov is medayik from Tosfos in Sukkah that the Kohanim, these children, had to be careful to stand at the very edge, only go into a place in the water where they could see all the way to the bottom to ensure that there's no tumah there. However, the Rambam and the Bat Nur and others, they, for a number of reasons, say that that precaution was not needed and they could go as far as they wanted into the actual water. The purpose of this water, they brought it to the Kohen. They brought it to the Kohanim, who added. The way the Rambam learns is they were the ones who added the ashes to the water, and they would have sprinkled it on the Kohen, which raised an interesting question that we know that a cotton is possible kaddish. We don't have to worry about that now. But this is their involvement. So here we see again the Shiloach is very much connected to the Beis Hamikdash. A third source where we see the connection between the Shiloach and the Beis Hamikdash is in Avos Rabbi Nassan. It says when the Kohanim would eat a lot of flesh, it's hard to digest if you have a lot of flesh. But they would then drink the Shiloach waters, and it became as easily digestible as other sustenance, presumably bread. Some of the Achronim asked, we know the Rambam says that one of the functions in the Beis Hamikdash was a doctor. Why did you need a doctor? For a number of reasons, but one of them is because the Kohanim are eating so much flesh, and it's not good for their stomachs. You need someone to help deal with that. So how do we reconcile the two? So different answers given. One answer is that given the exorbitant amount of meat that sometimes have to eat, they still needed to have a doctor. Maybe they weren't always using the Gichon, the Shiloach waters, whatever the case is. But this is what it says in Avos Rabbi Nassan. Then we have in Medrash Eicha, it says that when the Jewish people were exiled from after the time of the first Beis Hamikdash to Babel, so he said, if you would have been worthy, you would still be sitting in Yerushalayim today, and you'd be drinking the waters of the Shiloach, Shemem of Nekim U'Mesukim, that their waters are clean and sweet. However, since you did not have the merit, you're now in Babel, where you have the Euphrates, the Pras, and its waters are very very repulsive and turpid, etc. In Yahel the Tzemach Tzedek brings that this is also the meaning of Al Nahar is Babel. The Jewish people sat on the rivers of Babylon. Sham Yeshavnu Gam Bachinu B'Zachrenu Asin. What were they remembering? The Tzemach Tzedek says they're remembering the Gichon, they're remembering the Shiloach. They're sitting on the Haras Bavel, and they're remembering the other water that they had, and that is the waters of Shiloach and the Gichon. There's actually a very interesting halacha. It's a big machlekes harishonim, based on the Medrash Tanchuma. The Medrash Tanchuma brings that one of the psukim which are used with regard to the Gichon is, or the Shiloach, as we'll speak about it soon, Esmei HaShiloach HaHolchim La'at. The waters of the Shiloach, they flow gradually, slowly. La'at b'gematria arbaim. And that's how we know the word La'at is 40. That's how we know that a mikveh needs 40 sa'ah. So Rabbeinu Tam asked the question, hang on, we know that Mayan Matahar B'chol Shehu, that a spring, that it says in the Mishnah, in Masechta Mikvahs, that a mikveh requires 40 sa'ah, but a Mayan can purify even with a lot less than 40 sa'ah. This then leads to his shita la halacha, and it's a big machlekes. He says it must be that a person always needs 40 sa'ah, even if he's toveling in a mayan. And the whole idea that Mayim Matar B'chol Shehu is only with regards to a Kli, because we know in the times of the Beis Hamikdash they also immersed vessels for the sake of Tumah V'Tara. So because of that, you have this, that's the Pshat Mayim Matar B'chol Shehu. So he derives a halacha from the fact that the Medrash, this Medrash Tanchuma that connects the word La'at with this Mayon. Okay. We spoke over here that a mine is a spring, and I'd like to pivot then to another halacha. This is a matter of halacha, but again, bring out this idea of a spring. We'll focus on the Rambam, and the Rambam is speaking over here about the halacha of anointing kings. And there's a reason I'm bringing the Rambam, because the Rambam says something that the Gemara doesn't say clearly. Shemoshchen Malchei Beis David, and Moshchen Osen El Al Mayan. When you anoint the kings of the house of David, you only do it by a spring. Interestingly, I found in a sefer that an Ashkenazish Kehillah in Yerushalayim in the 18th and 19th century, they used to specifically go to the Gichon in order to do tashlich there. So it might be 19 or 20. Why? Because by that group, there's a tradition that maybe this does have to do, by them this was the Mayon. And we have this idea that kingship is associated with the Mayon. So Rosh Hashanah is all about Melucha. So they would do it over there. Okay, now, needless to say, I didn't have time to turn them into Ashkenazim. I don't think that's how Ashkenazim Yerushalayim look, but anyway. Okay, the Rambam adds something the Gemara doesn't say clearly anywhere. The Gemara speaks about anointing kings. The Rambam says, Malchei Beis David, kings of the house of David. Where did the Rambam get that from? Maybe we know there's the concept of a halachic king. We had Malchus Yisrael, Malchus Yehuda. How do we know that this idea of anointing next to a spring is just to connect it to Malchei Beis David? So the Kesef Mishnah, he says that we can explain this based on what the Rambam said before that. What is the symbolism of a spring? The symbolism of a spring is that it's constant. It doesn't stop. So therefore, the whole idea why we anoint a king next to the spring is to symbolize that his melucha, the dynasty, should never end. And therefore, the Rambam concludes, if so, the symbolism is only relevant to Malchus Beis David, because Malchus Beis David is the only kingdom that's going to come back at the time of Mashiach. But every other kind of Malchus won't, and therefore there's no need to anoint any other king next to a Mayan, just specifically a spring. So here we see one very big connection between the Shiloach, or the Gichon, and Malchei Beis David, and that is the fact that it's constantly flowing. Okay, this is supported by a Gemara. The Gemara does not mention Malchus Beis David, but it does mention this idea that when Shlomo HaMelech was anointed, David sent them all to the Gichon, right? I actually realized, sorry, I ran through that part of the slide I should have showed earlier. Sorry. So before this is describing the time, right? It's actually one of the Haftarahs, Chai Sarah, I think it is. So it describes over here how when it came time to anoint Shlomo HaMelech, David insisted that it was going to be done by the spring, and that means that he wasn't going to be there himself because he wasn't in a state that he could travel there, but he found it very important that he should be over there. All right, so one connection between Malchus Beis David is the fact that the spring, it symbolizes continuity. But then we have another very fascinating connection, an association between Malchus Beis David and the Shiloach, and this was based on a story that happens that's told in Yeshaya, Perek Ches. This is the only place in the entire Tanakh where this water is called the Shiloach. In other places called Mayonis, Gichon, you see over there it says Shiloach. And in the Psukim it speaks about some kind of contrast between the Assyrian king, who's like the mighty turbulent waters, and the Mei HaShiloach HaHolchim La'at, and the waters of the Shiloach that flow very slowly. What does this mean? We don't have to, as I just said, it's very clear what the mighty waters are referring to. That's Sancheirav, and Yeshaya was saying that the mighty waters are going to come and sweep away most of Eretz Yisrael. He does not identify what the slow-moving waters of the Shiloach are. What does that mean? There's some kind of contrast between Sancheirav and question mark. So the answer to this is discussed in a Gemara in Masechta Sanhedrin on Daf Tzadik Daled. It contrasts two kings. So it speaks about a king called Pekach ben Ramalyahu. We actually had him in Chitas this week. I think it was yesterday. Rashi brings in association with Argoiv. Pekach ben Ramalyahu was a king who was the ruler of the kingdom of Yisrael at the same time that Chizkiyahu was the kingdom of David. And it's contrast the two, that Chizkiyahu, despite being a king, he would focus on learning. I didn't notice the Latin letters, but now that it's so big, he probably didn't read Latin, unless I'm no Ksav Ivri, I don't know what that is. But anyways, he would eat a small, paltry amount of vegetables. And this was in contrast to Pekach ben Ramalyo, who ate 40 sa'ah, size of a mikveh geulah birdlings, for dessert. Who were the people impressed with? The people were impressed with Pekach ben Ramalyo. You saw grandeur, might, opulence, wealth. And this seemed a bit nebuch to the people, that here you have someone who's just could be king and he's just putting aside all of physicality and everything grand in order to learn Torah. Therefore, the prophet comes and says that because the people, what he's saying is over here is that the people, Katz Amma Hodain, that this nation has rejected or despised Malchus Sada Beis David. They despise the kingdom of Beis David to Madbar Lohin Benayach, that they guide the people gently, kamei Shiloach, like the Shiloach. In other words, the Gemara is giving us another symbol of the Shiloach being Malchus Beis David, not continuity, but leading the people gently and kindly. And it exactly captures the point that you had between the two, and that is that that you had the Chizkiyahu, since he's so gentle and kind, he's not involved in anything which is grand and mighty. However, Pekach ben Ramalyo is interested in chasing everything that he can. Over there actually mentioned Ritzin as well as Pekach ben Ramalyo. Yes, I don't know what they look like, but Pekach ben Ramalyo was the king of the 10 tribes, and he banded together with Ritzin Melech Aram to go, and he tried to conquer, tried to take away, to wrest away Yerushalayim for the kings of Yehuda. And the kings of the Yehuda, that's when they called Tiglath-Pileser in order to go and help defend them and successfully against this threat. So we see over here that the Shiloach represents the Malchus Beis David. And therefore what the Navi is saying is, because the people rejected Malchus Beis David and they wanted grand, amazing, majestic, very imposing things, I'm going to send you the king of that, and that's Sancheiriv, and you're going to see what tyranny he can bring along with that. And he went and he destroyed, conquered much of Eretz Yisrael. So put together, we see two very specific connections between Malchus Beis David and the Shiloach. Number one is the fact that it's gentle, like the kings are gentle, and number two, that it's continuous and it never ends. Okay, now this sheds light into a very famous Gemara, which is told about Chizkiyahu. The Gemara speaks about the things that Chizkiyahu did which were positive, and the things which seemed not positive. The Chachamim were not, they did not accept what he had done. And one of them was Sasam Gichon, that he blocked up the waters of the Gichon. This is the Gemara in Brachas, but I pulled in over here the Rashi from Sochem when he speaks about it. And it says over there in the Gemara that the Gichon blocked the springs was a bad thing. And the question is why? We just saw earlier that it seemed like the most strategic thing to do. The Assyrians are coming to attack the Jews. If you leave the water untouched, all the water will be available to the soldiers of Ashur, of Assyria, and the Jewish people will have no water. Why did he block? Why is it bad that he blocked up the waters? Rashi says the reason is he should have believed in Hashem. He should have had faith. Yeshaya came with a prophecy saying that Hashem said, "I'm going to protect this city in order to save it." What about Hishtadlus? So there is a Chassam Sofer who says that yes, we need to have Hishtadlus, but over here we're talking about a Haftacha. The Navi had given an assurance that everything would work out fine, so he should have had more emunah. Now, obviously, there's a pshat that comes from Rashi, so it's very solid authority backing it up. But the Mefoshim ask a whole lot of questions on Rashi's approach. First of all, if you look at the chronology of how it appears in Tanakh, the pasuk of V'ganoisi alo ir hazos is out of order. Chizkiyahu, if you follow the order of the psukim, Chizkiyahu diverted the waters way before Yeshayahu came with his nevuah of V'ganoisi alo ir hazos, which was just in the couple days before the final assault. That is question number one. Question number two, the Gemara uses the words Lo hoid lo Chachamim. The Chachamim did not, the Chacham that era did not agree with what Chizkiyahu did. But you look in the pasuk, and it says clearly that he did. He took counsel with his officers, his mighty men. Sarav is understood to be the members of the Sanhedrin, and they helped him. They assisted him. Everyone was behind him. So why does the Gemara say that the people of his time Lo hoid lo? So that's question number 2 to say on that Gemara. And the third question that you could have on the Gemara is we definitely see, and this is a whole Sikh of the Rebbe in Chelik Zayin in the Hisofis, you definitely do see the tremendous emunah Chizkiyahu had. And one way to demonstrate this is on the very day before Erev Pesach, Chizkiyahu is making his final assault against Yerushalayim, which looks a little bit different than that, right? Anyways, in Yerushalayim there was a machlekes between 2 figures. One of them on the left is Chizkiyahu, the other one is Shevna. There's a whole discussion in Tosfos too, exactly which biblical Shevna this is. And Shevna held that the Jewish people have to surrender to the Assyrians. The Gemara says Shevna was regarded as the bigger authority in Torah. He had more students than Chizkiyahu. He had a bigger crowd. He was a bit more charismatic, etc. And he held that we have to give in to the Assyrians. And the Gemara tells us that his was not l'shem shamayim, as the way some of Farshim explained, that he was hoping to side with, if he's going to side with Sancheriv, he might end up being the next king. He might be appointed as the king of the Jewish people. Against that backdrop, Yeshayahu comes to Chizkiyahu, and Chizkiyahu is ill. He's very, very sick. And Yeshayahu comes, we won't go through Barichas, but with a lot of nevuos, how he's going to get better, with signs, and so on and so forth. And that's when he said, V'ganoisi al ha'ir hazois. At the same time, Shebna HaSofer shoots out a message to the Assyrian army, saying that he has the bigger camp in Yerushalayim, and he's coming out to greet the king and to surrender to him. When it came time to leave Yerushalayim, the Gemara says that a malach came and slammed the door shut as soon as Shebna came, and none of his followers were able to join him, and that's why when he appeared before the Assyrian king, before Sancheriv, he says, where's all those thousands of people who you said were following you? And he was... I won't go into the excruciating death that he was given, but the Gemara says that, yeah. Anyways, what did Chizkiyahu do that night? He went to sleep, right? And the Rebbe says the fact that he went to sleep, he davened, he said to Hashem, I know we're facing the biggest problem now, I have such a munah, you're going to take care of it, please take care of it, and he went to sleep. Here, bitachin, thank you, bitachin. And the next morning when he woke up, kulam pigarim mesim, they were all dead corpses, and a lot of them had run away, etc., etc. So that is our third question. How could we fault Chizkiyahu for not having bitachin? He had the ultimate bitachin we see in so many other parts of the story. So there is another answer which is given. This, again, Rashi doesn't learn this way, but other Mefarshim, the Ben Yoyada and others say that what the problem with blocking the Shiloach was not a lack of bitachin in Hashem, but rather the Shiloach signifies Malchus Beis David. We just spoke about how this symbolized the Malchus Beis David in 2 ways. By Chizkiyahu blocking up the Gichon, he was blocking up the whole symbolism of Malchus Beis David. And Chizkiyahu said that's the worst thing you can do. It's not going to end in a good way. This story actually leads to a 3-part story, and we're getting towards the end. I do apologize. Strush is taking a bit long, but anyway. So a story which is told in 3 parts. First by the Chidah, then the Ben Yehoyada, and then more recently by the Sfadish Rabbonim of Yerushalayim, connected to this spring. The story starts, is told by the Chidah, that there was in Yerushalayim, on Friday afternoon, Yerushalayim would fall extremely quiet. Why? Because all the Arabs would go to pray, and the rule was that everything had to be blocked up. All the stores, everything had to be closed down. It became very quiet. When it's very quiet, you can hear things you normally can't. And the people could hear, if they late to the mosque, they would able to hear in bits and places trickling of water. And water was really an important thing in Yerushalayim. And back then, they didn't know where to get this water. Anyways, after some time, a student of the Arizal, Reb Chaim Vital, he comes to Yerushalayim, and you had one of the Arab leaders at the time. His name was Abu Sipin, which means father of the swords. He lived. I don't know where to put it. It's just going to fall here. Yeah, okay, so Abu Sipin is. He's one of the Arab leaders in Yerushalayim, and he definitely wants this water problem solved. So he heard Rabbi Chaim Vital is there, and he summoned him to come before him. And he told him that I heard from the Jews you're a very holy man, and I reckon that you can unblock the waters, the Gichon. So do that, or I'm going to kill you. What's Rabbi Chaim Vital going to do? He said the Abish's name, and next thing he's in Damascus, right? I don't know if they had English on the signs there, but he was in Damascus. He said the Abish's name and gone. Okay, that night the Arizal comes to him in a dream, and the Arizal explains to him that you just made the most terrible mistake of your life. He said that you are a Gilgul of Chizkiyahu HaMelech. Abu Sipin is a Gilgul of Sancheriv. What happens is that Chizkiyahu, he blocked the Gichon because he was worried about Sancheriv. Now, Sancheriv, in the form of Abu Sipin, is coming now to ask her to be unblocked. And you, as the Gilgul of Chizkiyahu, could have undone your mistake that your previous Gilgul has done. And had you done that, then we can sort of figure out where this is going to go. Had this done that, he keeps on dreaming how this is what you represent, then Mashiach would have come, and all of our problems would go away. However, since you did not proceed with this, the door has been locked, and unfortunately Mashiach's not coming. So when Reb Chaim Vitali continues in his dream, he was obviously very upset to hear this, and he says to Arizal, but I did this because I didn't want to make use of Shemus Kedoshim, of holy names, to do a miracle such as unblocking the Gichon. The Arizal said that would be a good defense if you didn't end up using the Shemus at all, but you used the Shemus to get to Damascus, so you could have used the Shemus to unblock the Gichon. Anyways, Reb Chaim Vital continues, if so, maybe I'll go back and I'll undo it now. And the Arizal said it's too late. It was a special Zeis Rotzen. It wasn't just about unblocking it, but doing it at the behest of Abu Sipin, and you didn't do that, and the moment is gone. That part of the story is told by the Chidah. The Ben Yehoyada, more famously known as the Ben Ish Chai, continued that in his time, or before his time, there was a shrine in Baghdad, which was this Arab Abu Sipin eventually moved from Yerushalayim to Baghdad, and he was buried there. And it started getting this reputation that if you go there and you pray at this shrine, miracles happen. And not only Goyim were going there, Jews were going there, and they were seeing salvation. One of the Mekubalim, his name was Rav Sasan Mordechai, understood that this is connected to, he had tremendous koyach connected to the Geulah Sancheira, but this is all koyches of the Klippus. So he purchased a home nearby, and he spent many nights on Kabbalah, and within a short amount of time, the whole aura of the place seemed to fade to the people. People stopped going there, and before long the whole thing turned into great disrepair, and it just became a complete ruins, and that was the end of it. So that's the part the Ben Yehoyada continues. More recently, the Rabbanim of Yerushalayim continue that in the following generation there was a sequel to that story. The house that Rav Sasan Mordechai lived in, unfortunately one of the walls started falling apart. They called in some Arab workers to fix it. And as they're fixing it, they found in a certain cavity, they found a scroll. And one of the Arabs picks up the scroll, and as soon as he picks it up, he drops dead. So they realized something's up. They called the Jews, and the Jews called the rabbi, and the rabbi said that no Arab should touch the scroll. He had one Yid go to mikveh and do a lot of hachanis, put the scroll back, and then only Jewish workers should go around rebuilding that wall. And they say that when they looked at the scroll, there was no writing there, but there was a lot of etching that existed in that wall. So the Ben Yehoyada brings a story to bring out that this was not just about the city being saved. This is a spring that has to do with Malchus Beis David, and in fact we see in this story a clear connection to Mashiach and to the Geulah. Now in Sfarim it makes another connection to Chizkiyahu. Here the Gemara in Masechta Sanhedrin asks the question, why is it in this pasuk, without getting into the details, this pasuk foretells the birth of Chizkiyahu. And if you look over there, it says, Lamarba HaMisra, to him who increases the authority. It's describing the whole description about Chizkiyahu. We see something that happens only once in the entire Tanakh. The word marba it's a shlos mem, it's a closed mem. And in the middle of a word, you don't have a shlos mem. So Gemara asks the question, Bibnei ma kol mem sheba emtza teva pasuach v'zeh sosum. Why is it that every mem in the middle of a word is open and this one is closed? Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu lasis Chizkiyahu Mashiach, Hashem wanted to make Chizkiyahu Mashiach, and the Gemara continues, I won't read the whole thing, that because he made a certain mistake, he was not Mashiach. Mashiach begins with the letter mem, and therefore it was blocked up. In Svarim it is bought. In the Radal, Rabbi David Luria, he wrote a sefer on Pirkei de Rebbe Lezer. He says that he sees in Kisvei HaArizal that the reason why Chizkiyahu was not Zeich to be Mashiach was because he blocked the Gichon. So he gives a different reason, which is connected to the Gichon. Again, we see this connection between Mashiach, Malchus Beis David Mashiach, and the Gichon. And perhaps this gives us a bit more insight into what Tosfos Rabbeinu Peretz said without explaining. Some kind of salvation is going to happen from this Shiloach. So, according to this Mekubalim who speak about it, this is very much connected with the coming of Mashiach. Okay, so I'm just thinking, given the time, skip the next few ones. I'll just conclude with one more Maimer Chazal. And this is a Maimer Chazal which appears in it's in Erchin, it's also Yerushalmi, in Sukkot, Tosefta Erchin, etc. It speaks about Agrippas. Agrippas there was a couple of them, but this is Agrippas, who was a descendant of Hurdus, and he was regarded as a righteous, a king who was a tzaddik who did what was right, as we even had the Simon Masechta Seit that speaks about how he was very well beloved by the people. So the Gemara tells us that when Agrippas, when he came to the Gichon, he decided, or the Shiloach, initially the water, it was pouring water out of a very small space. So he wanted more water, so he said, make the hole wider. What happened? When they widened it, instead of more water coming, less water came. Then they went and they made it small again, and now it started to flow the way it was originally. And the Gemara says from here we learn the lesson that Al Yishal Chacham b'Chachmasei, that a Chacham shouldn't be praise himself too much with his wisdom, Al Yishal Gibber b'Gvarasei, etc. Now, first of all, this is complete conjecture, but I mentioned earlier that there was presumed to be some kind of siphoning system over there, and perhaps, I don't know, widening and narrowing could somehow have messed up with that and produced that result. But anyways, the part which is negated to us is the Rebbe spoke about this specific Gemara a number of times, many Farbrengens in Toras Menachem, but in general two ideas. And that is, we see that smallness carries with it the power of a great flow, and greatness doesn't have that power. What does this symbolize? Sometimes the Rebbe spoke about this. It's the difference between Kabbalah Soul and Seichel. We can either act with Kabbalah Soul, which is smallness. I think a certain way, but I'm putting the way I think aside in order to do what I know the Eibishter wants me to do. That is going to produce the flow. However, if a person tries to expand beyond Kabbalah Soul and just approach keeping Torah and Mitzvah, serving Hashem with a lot of intellect, then what he might find after some time is that the flow actually diminishes. There's reducing returns. So the main thing is to serve the Eibishter with Kabbalah Soul. So that is one of the ideas which the Rebbe brings out from there. But the other idea which the Rebbe spoke about also a couple of times is how you serve Hashem. Very similar, although the Rebbe didn't connect it, but very similar with the difference between the two kings, Pekach ben Remaliah and Chizkiyahu. You could have someone who serves Hashem with smallness, because he's so genuine, right? There's no fanfare, there's no hoo-ha. He just does what he needs to do. And when people are looking at that, it doesn't seem exciting or amazing, but he's completely genuine. And that will produce a tremendous flow. Then you have other people there's a lot of fanfare, there's a lot of excitement, but it's also a lot of fakeness. And that doesn't produce the flow that needs to be. And the lesson that we take from that is that if we approach Yiddishkeit with being genuine, then we're able to have the flow that we need to have. And in conclusion, always to conclude with Mashiach, there is a school of thought that says that the pasuk that Micha speaks about, Umayim Mibeis Hashem Yotza, that the spring is going to come forth from the house of Hashem, from the Kodesh Kodashim, that again is the rebirth of the Gichon. It's flowing out of the Kodesh Kodashim, and we should be Zeicha to Mashiach's coming, and we'll see exactly what happens and what the emes is. We should see that taken Yad Mamish.